Hi, Doodles here. I saw that some had requested it, so give the people what they want, right? You guys seem to like the hair videos. Yep, oh I know. I am completely aware with the way I talk. My brother talks the same way. We don't know why, and everybody likes to talk about it. So here's a fun challenge. I'm going to try my best not to talk like that and overpronouncing my T's and D's and whatever else I do. And if I mess up somewhere in the video, you guys can call me out, and it could be a fun little game. And it starts now. Okay, so we're talking about hair again. And this one is a pretty interesting ride because I actually lived throughout all of the 2000s. I was born in the 90s, so I missed some of it. So let's hop right into the discussion here. Let's take a look at men's 2000s hairstyles. So, where do I begin? I guess I'll start with an introduction thingy-ma-doody. Now, a big theme from the 2000s, and I'll be looking more into it later, is tamed haircuts. Relatively tamed. Of course, every decade has their type of more louder look. But I think in culture, this was like the 2000s was kind of like a rest period for hairdos, almost. For a lot of guys, it was just, let's have a standard, nice looking hairdo, nothing too extreme. This is a new millennium. And in many ways, it sort of makes it feel like the 2000s is hard to define sometimes as far as hair, but definitely you can point out the looks of that time. Alright, so I guess we can start with the looks that are definitely from the early 2000s. Alright, a lot of you guys like this one, and I did a video on this haircut and it got pretty popular. And I'm very thankful. The curtains haircut, or curtain hair. Yay! This hairdo got a lot of attention on the men's 90s hairstyles video, and it got its own video, and it's a haircut that's current right now, which is interesting. But as haircuts do, they blend into the next decade sometimes. And it blended in pretty strong, but as it got to the mid-2000s, that kind of look faded away. And I talked about this in my men's 90s hairstyles video, and I also touched up on it in the actual curtains hairstyle video. But if you pay close attention, you can see that there's a progression in this haircut when it came to a lot of guys who had this hair in the early 2000s. As the 2000s rolled in, it became more of a thing to have a styled, slick, and textured look to the haircut. Now, of course, something related to the curtains haircut is the undercut, which was something also that was heavily fading out. Something somewhat related, the bowl cut or mushroom cut, which was around but was mostly a child's thing, which quickly faded out also. And blunt-like haircuts would quickly fade out. Alright, next one, the Jerry curl, I'm kidding. Spiked hair. Now, spiked hair became a trend out of the 90s, but it blended into the 2000s and became very much a 2000s haircut, very strong. Now, this haircut was worn by all kinds of different styles, and you also had your variations of it. Maybe more long, lengthy, and loud if you're more into like the rock or punk scene. A little more tamed for something else, but it was definitely something that a lot of guys were practicing as a hairstyle to go to. Now, a detail that gives it its 2000s look is the spiked out kind of outwards and sort of all over the place, maybe some messy spikes too. When spikes came back around as more of a look in the early 2010s, typically very tight sides and spikes with more direction than you would be able to see in maybe the 2000s, late 90s. Also in the 2000s and late 90s too, maybe less attention to how proper and tidy the sides are, although sometimes you do get the very tight sides in the 2000s and 90s. But I would say, seeing as the trend went in the early 2000s, you would see guys with maybe less attention on how tight or proper and kept the sides are, as compared to maybe the early 2010s when a lot of these guys were wearing the more spiked look with maybe like skin fades or disconnected sides or very extremely tight sides, things like that. Buzz cuts. Now, once again, I think the 2000s really brought in the idea of having a tamed hairstyle, and the most tamed hairstyle there is, I guess, is the buzz cut. Now, in the 90s, I would say black men had more styles that they would be wearing where the hair is more grown out, such as the jerry curl or the flat top. As the flat top faded out into the late 90s, even still they had maybe more of a longer style, but I think as the 2000s came and it's more tamed, a more relaxed look, you saw a lot of black men just kind of wearing it real short. And then of course other races are also getting the buzz cut. I feel like since the 2000s was more of a tamed age, that the buzz cut became a very suitable experimental hairstyle to do, since it's very easy and tamed. I do get the vibes that it was quite popular in the hip-hop community, but yeah, buzz cuts. Cornrows. Now, this was more popular in the black community, but you would get other races that would do it too. Now, cornrows is rows of hair sectioned off on your head, and they rest in braids, and it was something that was experimented with in the hip-hop community. I probably should have talked about this earlier, but frosted tips. So frosted tips was something that came out of the 90s, but it also blended into the 2000s very strong, as hair dye became something that many people were experimenting with out of the 90s era, and also blending into the 2000s, and especially as a lot of guys were abandoning longer hairstyles for the spiked hairstyles, and a lot of guys would have the frosted tips along with the spikes. Now, I remember as a kid that highlights were somewhat popular amongst the kids. I remember this one kid told me that I should get highlights. Now, I wonder if that was considered to be the same thing as frosted tips. I do remember it being somewhat similar, but that type of look became quite a thing, especially in the early 2000s. Alright, this next one must be talked about in great lengths because there's a lot to say. Bangs hairstyles. Now, this is quite a huge deal in the 2000s. Now, what happened is parting your hair became something that many people chose to abandon. Now, in the 90s, parting your hair was quite fashionable. In the 2000s, this turned around and it became more fashionable to not part your hair. Even when hair got pretty long, still, people would go out of their way to not part their hair. Now, there are many variations of how to wear this bangs haircut. Now, initially, I think a lot of guys in the 90s traded in their haircuts, their longer haircuts, for maybe a bangs look, as it was the next option after, which wasn't that big of a change. But having a bangs type of look, as it solidified itself in the 2000s, you would get your variations of it. So I'll start off with talking about how in the 2000s there was a bit of a movement where it became cool to grow your hair longer. I want to do my best to present each case that I can come up with as far as having the bangs look. So let me start off with this one. So grown out hair but with bangs. Now I personally call this the 7th grader haircut because it's kind of like you're in the 7th grade and you're hitting the teen years and you sort of want to be like rebellious and cool, so you grow out your hair, but it's like you're too oblivious and naive to grow out the front. Now I know maybe people will just call this maybe wings. Now I know you can find on Wikipedia them talking about this hair feature or what have you, but when I was going to school, people would call it hat hair. Now, hat hair is kind of related to what would come in the, let's call it the Justin Bieber haircut, where kind of having that shaggy but textured skater-ish hairstyle, and often wings would be part of that. Now, why they call it hat hair is because wearing a hat really reinforced this look. Wearing a hat would keep your hair on the top being weighed down, and kind of, maybe because of the tightness, it would often cause your hair to lift up on the sides a bit. Now, I don't doubt that guys would actually maybe try to blow dry it or reinforce their hair trying to make it dry like that. But wearing the hat kind of reinforced that look and definitely help maintain the flat and then wings. And what would come a little later is the flip, having to flip. This was maybe just a little bit before the flip became a huge part of the hairstyle, or the hairstyle scene amongst men, or what have you. Okay, let's get into it. The flipped bangs, or swoop. So I hear some people call it the swoop or the flip. I say flip because they flip their hair over or flip their hair to the side. Also known as the Justin Bieber hair. I always never liked when people called it the Bieber hair because the haircut came around before he was big. So, I mean, he had the haircut because the haircut became popular. But then he became popular. But he became popular when the haircut was still pretty fresh, so I don't blame people. Now, this one is pretty specific. There's a reason why it has the look that it does. I'm going to put these together because they do look somewhat similar and somewhat related, let's say. But so I'm not going to necessarily call these the same haircut, but they're very related. And just as styles do, things become related, and I guess I'll touch on that a little more. But the thing with the Bieber haircut, or the swoop or flip, is that it has an exaggerated, let's say, constant movement in the hair, and it needs, and this is very this is something that really needs to be paid attention to, is that it needs a lot of texture, but the texture also creates the movement. So when people flip, there's a lot of texture that promotes the visual of the hair swooping over, and that became cool, and that became a trend for guys to flip their hair. And I'm going to be throwing up these images. Of course, it's very easy to see that the texture is showing. It's almost like waves, like you have waves going in a direction, and it's just the hair that goes into the direction, which creates that illusion of this flipped over to the side. It's just this exaggerated swoop of things. Now, why I guess I'm kind of saying that the images that I've shown are like sort of different, though they are related, is that there's less of an exaggeration, which it kind of changes it up a bit as far as the feel of the haircut. And I mean exaggeration of movement. Now, like I just talked about earlier, wings was often also a feature of the haircut, but I do think that the movement and direction of the hair became more of the focus later on. But that hat hair look definitely kind of turned into this flip haircut thing. Now, that specific look I'm talking about is definitely something that came out of the late 2000s, which really bled into the early 2010s really strong, because the flip to the side haircut became quite popular in the 2010s and was worn by a lot of, I would say, young men, teen boys. So I guess I won't put this in a category, but I'll talk about it, is that having a type of direction with the bangs look did become something that was quite popular, where I guess perhaps just having it straight down could have been seen as maybe more of less style to it, less interesting maybe, like maybe having it a little to the side gives it a little bit more flavor, if you will. But then it's like, is it exactly like the Bieber haircut? Or is it just the style or the fashion of having long fringes and maybe some direction to it? Because I would say maybe not all the haircuts that had direction, like kind of a little off to the side, I'm not sure that all of these guys at the time were doing that head flip just to get the hair swooped over with the layering all going the one direction, but maybe just kind of moving it aside. But at the same time, knowing that the direction is just a part of the style in general to have longer bangs and having some type of direction. But again, it's heavily related in the theme of the hair movement of the times, whatever. Also, you can get the kind of punk bangs look where it's like, it's just this reinforced fringe that kind of goes into the eyes and gives it kind of an attitude look. Now, I hope I covered this section well, because bangs was just a huge part of the 2000s, I would say. Just bangs in general, it was quite the trend. Next on the list is emo hair and scene hair. Now, I would say the two are related to each other. Now, I remember a big theme of the emo look was having one of your eyes covered, so definitely having a very face-covering hair was a big part of it. Now, you guys can tell me otherwise, but from what I gather, I think the difference between emo and scene, in the sense of looks, as far as hair anyway, is a scene is maybe a little bit more exaggerated and loud, where emo is a little bit more tamed. See, the vibes I get from the emo scene is it's more like it's expressive but reserved, so dark styled, very styled, but not too blown out, where I think scene really takes part in having these large visual indicators of what's happening, though they are related. Now, what does cause these two to be related is a lot of texture, a lot of layering, point cutting, getting these layers in there, and really making the hair have these wisps, coming into wisps, and the movements. Now, something that's interesting is that, just like how I was kind of talking about how things are related and there's a theme in the hair culture, if you will, but I do find a lot of things that are related to the Bieber cut in this fashion, where it is very much a theme to have a certain type of movement and a constant flow at times, where there's a lot of layering which indicates the movement and where it's going, a lot of a brushed overness. That's probably not a word, but brushed overlooks. But on top of that, not being shy and having an exaggerated version of that, where it's extremely brushed over, and it becomes kind of the style of it. Now, I'll get into this one. Now, I wouldn't say this one was super popular, but it had its popularity. The Mohawk. Now, the Mohawk is shaved, really short sides, and just in the middle having hair, just like kind of like a stripe going down. Now, I remember seeing people trying to rock this in the 2000s. Now, a closely related one, the faux hawk. Now, this one would be obviously more popular. It's less loud, it's less severe. What I find interesting with this hair is that throughout the 2000s, it's had its popularity and guys would rock it, but then in the 2010s, in the early 2010s, it got even more popular over again. It's weird. Now, I'm going to go through ones that maybe weren't as big, but was definitely something that was happening. The mini fro. There was a bit of a movement where black men was growing out their hair a bit, but this time, instead of the 70s giant fro, it's more of a tamed, well-kept fro. And you also had guys from other races who had the curly hair growing it out. I do remember when I was younger, letting your curls grow out was kind of a popular thing to do. If you had curly hair, they just let it grow out and just let it curl out. And that was pretty popular with guys with curly hair for a bit. So my hair is pretty straight at a certain length. Sometimes if I don't really do anything with it, when it's drying, it has a bit of a texture wave to it. But actually, if I grow it pretty long, the big waves come out. And sometimes my hair would actually be pretty puffy itself. And I remember my dad saying that it was it's pretty popular for guys with curly, wavy hair to just grow it out and let it fly, or let it flow, I mean. And I remember my dad telling me that the girls like it as I was heading into high school, so that was something I remember. Another one that wasn't like super huge, but it's definitely something that was going on, was the 2000s mullet. Now, what separates this from the 80s version of it is that it has a more kept look, very styled, a lot of layering and texture at the same time, not as loud. So in the 80s, you get guys with these mullets where it's fairly short at the top and ridiculously long on the back. You wouldn't be seeing that with the 2000s mullet, more tamed, but still playing around with the length at the back. Another quick thing to mention is hair gel. I think nowadays all the rage is kind of like the pomades, the clays, the pastes, but back in the day we had hair gel. People were using that. It had more of a hard, shiny texture, crusty texture, but now people are more experimenting with other kinds of product. Now I guess we can just go straight into it. A big theme of men's 2000s hair is tamed haircuts. Just kind of fairly normal all around, nothing too loud as like the general thing that was happening. If you go look up, say, like a class picture, you know, you probably won't find things that are too much. Maybe with the teenagers, maybe kind of like this more of a skater hair look thing. But even if you look in movies and pop culture in the 2000s, a lot of it is just tame stuff, just kind of a normal haircut. Again, I think a theme of the 2000s is kind of a rest period from all the more loud experimental stuff from the generations before, or the decades before rather. As a whole, a lot of the looks that was going on in men's 2000s hair is just kind of a tamed look. Well, I guess that's it. I really hope I didn't miss anything. Wow, this is about 20 minutes long, which was just like the 90s hairstyles video was about 20 minutes long too. I really hope you guys enjoyed that. And to all of you out there, it would mean a huge deal to me if you guys hit the subscribe button. Me and my brother want to do a lot of things on this channel, so yeah, it would mean a lot to us. And thank you so much for watching this video. Have a nice day.
Woke up this morning, I got that craving. I have this longing, I got that hungry. I got a rubbing feeling and it won't go away. I think I'm gonna crack. You know what I want, I need my fix. I want my breadsticks.